Hey guys, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and this time I've got a full preview for you on the brand new Tier 8 Swedish premium tank destroyer, the STRV S1, which has full access to the brand new hydro-pneumatic suspension that the top tier Swedish tank destroyers have. This vehicle is going to be quite different to the standard Tier 8 Swedish tank destroyer, the UDES, and going to be more similar to the Tier 9 and the Tier 10 Swedish tank destroyers. And this vehicle should be special for a variety of players. Number one, somebody who wants a high tier Swedish premium vehicle and wants to make some credits. Secondly, anyone who can't be bothered to grind up to the top tier Swedish tank destroyers to be able to experience the hydro-pneumatic siege mode. And thirdly, anyone who absolutely loves the top tier Swedish tank destroyers and wants to amplify their crew training. Firstly, I'm going to compare this vehicle to the Tier 8 and Tier 9 Swedish tank destroyers, tell you what you've got to look forward to with this tank, and follow it up with some ace tanker gameplay. So here we have the S1 on the left, and we're going to compare it to the standard Tier 8 Swedish tank destroyer, the UDES 03, as well as against two fairly similar Tier 8 German tank destroyers, the Scorpion and the Kanonen Jagdpanzer. So immediately we notice that the S1 has a comparable DPM to the Kanonen Jagdpanzer, and it's only 100 less than the Scorpion. And immediately you might think that this vehicle has a DPM advantage over the UDES, but there's one important thing to know about the UDES, and that is that its DPM increases significantly by nearly 15% when you do enter the siege mode. And so this means that inside the siege mode, the differences in DPM between these two vehicles is negligible. But at least that's already an advantage for the S1, that you don't have to stay in siege mode to be able to reload your gun at the optimum rate. The two Swedish tank destroyers use 105mm with 390 alpha and very impressive penetration, 288 on its standard rounds. And in fact, that makes the S1 the highest base penetration premium vehicle in the game, and by a long shot, we're talking about by 42mm. This vehicle's penetration is only outclassed by Tier 10 tank destroyers, which makes it a very interesting prospect for being a premium vehicle. One thing that's also incredible about the Swedish tank destroyers is the shell velocity, 1,450 meters a second, which enables this vehicle to match the awesome M4A1 Revolurise with regards to shell velocity. This makes the S1 a sniper's dream, and you really have to give very little lead, if any, even at long ranges. And you're never going to have to worry about running out of ammunition in this tank, as you've got 50 105mm rounds, which gives you a potential damage of just shy of 20,000. So how about the gun handling on the S1? Well, immediately you might think that this is absolutely awful. 0.4 accuracy, 3 seconds aim time, what is this? And of course, these are the statistics of the tank when you're outside the siege mode. And when you enter it, your vehicle gets oh so much better. Your aim time goes from 3 seconds down to 1.4 seconds. Your accuracy goes from 0.4 down to 0.3, which puts it amongst the best in the game. But I should mention that the accuracy is not quite as good as the UDES's 0.25 inside the siege mode, which literally is the best in the game, along with the Tier 10 Swedish tank destroyer, the STRV 103B. But when we compare the tank's performance to the excellent Scorpion when it's inside the siege mode, it has better aim time, the same accuracy, and also the vehicle has better gun depression when it's inside the siege mode, as the depression of the tank is 11 degrees. But that's not quite as good as the UDES, which has 14 degrees of gun depression. One thing I must mention, however, is that the UDES doesn't have the gun fixed to the tank. And so this means that you can actually raise the gun up, which can be very useful for when you want to engage somebody who's above you and not have to enter the siege mode. The S1, just like the Tier 9 and the Tier 10 Swedish tank destroyers, doesn't have any gun elevation at all, as it is locked in place to the hull. And so to be able to elevate this gun, you have to enter the siege mode and physically raise the tank up and down to be able to engage your opponents. Now onto mobility, and the S1 kind of falls behind the other vehicles in the comparison here. Its top speed limit is 50 kilometers an hour. That's certainly not bad, but it's not UDES great like 70. But the vehicle is able to go back exceptionally quickly, 45 kilometers an hour. And so you're going to be able to run away from pretty much every single heavy tank in the game. And you're even going to be able to at least keep distance from medium tanks as long as they don't get the jump on you. However, this reverse speed is not quite as good as the UDES's 50 kilometers an hour. And furthermore, the vehicle kind of struggles with its power to weight ratio. It's just over 16 compared to the UDES, which is over 20 86. And so certainly don't expect to be the kind of mountain goat that the UDES is capable of if you watched my full review on that tank. And furthermore, the vehicle's ground resistances are worse than the standard Tier 8 Swedish tank destroyer. And if you've ever played a Scorpion G, then you're pretty much going to know how fast the S1 is, as the Scorpion's power to weight ratio is just a little bit better and its ground resistances are a touch better on hard but the same on medium. Of course, that's until you have to go backwards in the tank. So what about the traverse speeds? Well, interestingly enough, the effective traverse speeds of this tank when it's outside the siege mode are not exactly excellent. They're less than the Scorpion on hard, slightly better on medium but practically the same, and a bit better on soft. And it certainly does feel like it takes a while to turn the tank, but interestingly enough, when you enter the siege mode in this tank, look how the traverse speeds increase. The traverse speeds pretty much go up by about 50%, which is very unusual because when we look at the Tier 9 Swedish tank destroyer, it actually loses traverse speed when it goes into siege mode. Talking about siege mode, there's one very important thing that I should highlight about the S1, and that is when you're inside it, your speed limit will go down to 8 kilometers an hour. But anyone who's played the UDES will know that that is a luxury because the UDES is limited to 5 kilometers an hour inside its siege mode. And that makes the S1 so much better on ridge lines than the UDES, which is just too slow to be able to creep over, and quite often the enemies will pull back just as they see you, and then you won't be able to hit them. And furthermore, while the UDES takes 2 seconds to leave the siege mode, the STRV S1 is faster. It only takes 1.25 seconds to leave the siege mode, making this vehicle just so much more comfortable than the standard Tier 8 Swedish tank destroyer. So now onto the armor of the S1, and all UDES players out there will know that that is the worst thing about the tank. The fact that the UDES gets 20 millimeters of all-round armor means that it gets overmatched by all 61 millimeter caliber guns. The S1, on the other hand, has 30 millimeters of all-round armor, and so that means that this vehicle can actually ricochet all armor-piercing rounds if it's pointing its gun directly at the opponents, up to 90 millimeters in caliber. And here's a good example of that. Let's see how well a Walker Bulldog does with its 76 millimeter caliber gun. And that's because of the shape of the hull. It's just so well angled that when you keep your gun facing towards your opponents, you've got about 75 degrees of angled armor, both on the lower plate and also on the upper plate. But remember that heat rounds do not work in the same way, and they will not ricochet until 85 degrees. And so let's see what the Bulldog does to the front of the S1 when it's firing heat. Yeah, it's just one of the most frustrating things about the high-tier Swedish tank destroyers that rely on their armor, and that's as soon as somebody loads high-explosive anti-tank rounds, then your armor is completely useless. And I should also mention that the hull of the tank is much smaller than it looks. Visually, it looks like you could shoot the S1 all over the tank to be able to penetrate it, but don't shoot it on the left here. This doesn't actually count as the hull of the tank, and you're going to waste your ammunition. You have to shoot towards the center of the vehicle to also be able to damage it. And so how do you take on one of these tanks if you find it on the battlefield? Well, firstly, you need to know what the caliber of your gun is. If it is 91 millimeters in caliber and higher, you can shoot anywhere on the hull of the tank and you're easily going to penetrate it because you will overmatch its armor. However, let's say you're using an 88 millimeter gun. What are your options now? Well, do not waste AP or APCR shooting at the hull because it's going to ricochet every single time. But if your tank has access to heat rounds, you want to load them immediately because then you're going to go through the tank every single time. Now, what if your tank doesn't have high explosive anti-tank rounds? What can you do then? Well, what you want to do is aim at the cupola of the vehicle. It's quite fat and it is also very flat, and this should be a nice easy target for everybody to be able to penetrate. But it is quite a small target, so definitely don't aim at this if you know you can overmatch the hull of the tank. And finally, if neither of these are an option because you've got a very inaccurate gun that's maybe damaged and you can't snipe the cupola, then I recommend you load high explosive rounds and just shoot anywhere on the front of the vehicle, and you're likely to do about 100 to 200 up to very high amounts of damage depending on the caliber of your gun. So while the S1's armor is exceptional in certain circumstances and will get you through a lot of fights, especially in your top tier matchups, one thing that isn't great about the tank is the hit points. 1000 is very standard for a tier 8 tank destroyer, the same as the UDES, but quite a bit less than the Scorpion and also the Kanon and Jagdpanzer, so if you do start to get penetrated, then you're not going to last very long. And furthermore, the view range of this tank is quite poor as well at 350 meters, and so you definitely want to be using binoculars on this tank. Talking about view range, that brings me on to one of the best things about the S1, and that is that it's exceptionally sneaky. Even without a camouflage net, your vehicle is going to have over 50% camo, and when you're moving, that is at 32% camo. That means that somebody with 450 meters view range is not going to see you at 350 meters as long as you're not firing, even if you're moving. And if you do choose to use a camouflage net on this tank, then you have some very impressive camouflage at 65%, of course, when you've got a full crew loadout and you've put a sweet paint job on the tank. And even when you're firing, you're going to have 13% camo. That is rather nice, and one of the highlights of the vehicle for me, that it will be able to play the role of a long-range sneaky sniper, although just not quite as good as the UDES. But anyway, I think that's quite enough theory crafting. Let's see how the S1 performs in some gameplay. So a completely average matchup here for the S1. We are right in the middle of it with a wealth of tier 9, tier 8 and tier 7 tanks on the enemy team. Remember, this is a tier 8. I keep having to pinch myself because I always think I'm playing the STRV 1030 at tier 9. And of course, then you're going to not be seeing all the tier 6 tanks on the enemy team. And let me tell you, 30mm of armor when it's this well angled does exceptionally well against tier 6 tanks. But let's just take a look down the enemy team list and think what tanks are going to have 90mm guns. Okay, definitely not the Conqueror. 120mm, 122, 105 overmatches me, 155, 122, 122, 120, 152, 128, 128, 120, 122, 105, 90, and a 90mm. So that means that unless any of these tanks are not using their top guns, such as the T29 on the enemy team, then there are only 2 tanks on the enemy team that are not going to overmatch my armor. And so I really want to stress this to you, that when you're in a matchup like this, you cannot afford to get shot in this tank, and your 1000 hit points will not go a long way. And so that means that you want to try and play as more of a sneaky tank. But when you do get into a top tier matchup where you're playing against a lot of tier 6s, tier 7s, and hopefully a lot of tier 8 mediums that are not things like scorpions on the enemy team, then your armor will count for a lot, and you can safely sit in front of enemies that are using 90mm caliber guns and less, as long as of course they're not firing heat rounds, or until they get frustrated and they just decide to fire high explosive rounds at you. So get a feel for the mobility of the S1 here. It's certainly not as good as the other tier 8 and tier 9 and tier 10 Swedish tank destroyers that use the hydropneumatic suspension, but it's certainly not slow. And being able to go backwards at 45 kilometers an hour certainly is a great thing as well. So we were unable to get any shots across the open field there. Well, I took a couple of shots, but we'll have to see whether we hit them later on in the replay. But I want to progress and try and help my Zerg down the east of the map to be able to overwhelm these opponents, and then hopefully fall back to be able to defend the cap circle. That was the plan, at least. We enter the siege mode by pressing our X key. It takes us 2 seconds to get into it, and bam, look at the aim time inside the siege mode, or shall I say the lack of aim time inside the siege mode. And the 0.3 accuracy means that it's just so easy to be able to put shots into your opponents. Oh, lovely shot there into the cupola of the T30. When you're in this kind of a situation in the S1, you do feel very confident indeed. But of course, I've got to be careful because that T30 will remove 3/4 of my hit points, and he will overmatch the top of my tank. So you definitely want to watch out for that. Now the east has been won, we're going to make our way back towards the west, and here we go. It wouldn't be a preview of this tank if I didn't show you how well this vehicle goes backwards. One thing I'd also like to highlight, guys, is that I didn't actually mention this in the armor model, but these 2 track links over here count as being a little bit thicker. Let me tell you exactly how much. Yep, there's a little bit which is 45mm thick. So if you're shooting at this tank, avoid shooting those at all costs, because they are going to ricochet unless you're above the tank or he's not angling his armor. But of course, if he's pointing his gun at you, he is angling his armor. Now I'm going to show you my favorite thing about the S1, and that is this 105mm gun. Sure, you don't have the highest DPM on this tank, but you're just so darn reliable. The reliability of this gun is incredible. With the 288mm of penetration on your standard rounds, you really don't have to fire many APCR. Well, sorry, the APCR is standard. I should say you don't have to fire any premium rounds, because 288mm of penetration is tremendous. And even in a matchup like this, where we're definitely not top tier, you just don't have to waste credits like you would do playing a variety of other Tier 8 premium tanks, including something like the Defender. You know, that's fairly new. It's got 230, which is excellent, but that's fairly standard for Tier 8s. Look how we can just pop over the ridgeline, and I decided to actually leave the siege mode there and pull back. Because when you leave the siege mode on a ridgeline like this, you actually hide the top of your tank fairly quickly. And this vehicle can just do things that the UDES can't. If I was playing in the UDES, I would be absolutely petrified about going up on this ridgeline because you creep forwards at 5 kilometers an hour, which is a hell of a lot slower than the 8 kilometers an hour speed limit that you have inside the siege mode of the S1. Fair enough, the UDES would have maybe a little bit better accuracy, but at these mid to long range, well, at these mid-range engagements, I don't really need it. Will I be able to shoot the cheeks of the IS-3? Oh, it just goes up into his turret ring but fails to penetrate. And we're quickly up to 3,000 damage. And so if you like this kind of sniping roll towards the middle part of the map, I pull back. Just how quickly you can aim at your opponents and pull back, give them such a small target. This is something that you're going to have to do in the S1 if you want to be successful in it. You have to push up over the slope, clutch a shot, and pull back. And if you do this and you react fast enough, then you're not going to take too many hits. And even if you do take one occasionally from the IS-3, it's not the end of the world. But let's see where that shell hit. Yep, just straight up overmatch. He's got a 122mm caliber gun. That's always going to go through that part of the tank. Oh, what a shame. The 0.3 accuracy letting me down a little bit there, and it looks like the shell dipped. I should be able to put one into the cheeks. Will I be able to hit the T29? There we go. 288mm of standard penetration on this tank just feels absolutely awesome, and I'm feeling pretty good about myself there. We were able to pick up 4,000 damage fairly quickly and stop the entirety of an enemy advance. Sure, there was some impact from things like the T30 as well. It's not like I did that single-handed. My team played well as well. But doing 4,000 damage in a Tier 8 premium, this is some big credits. And we've done it in a fairly short period of time, 5 to 6 minutes. That hasn't taken us too long. And the vehicle, while its engine power isn't the best, its power to weight isn't exactly incredible, and we're limited by the power to weight and not the top speed limit as we advance here, it's enough to be able to get around and clean up at the end of the game. Shutting down the T34, pushing our damage total up to 4,400. So right now I'm a bit worried about the ISU-152 on the enemy team. He's got 152mm with 750 alpha damage. That means that he's going to be able to one-shot me most of the time. I can take a hit from the Scorpion, however, if I can manage to find him. I really actually quite enjoyed the playstyle of the S1, but, you know, I love the UDES as well. There's certainly no doubt that the UDES is by far the better sniping tank. With better camo, the ability to elevate the gun as well does give it a little bit extra flexibility, 14 degrees of gun depression, and the fact that the tank is way faster, forwards, backwards, engine power, everything. We fire a blind one there at the Scorpion. Will we be able to hit him? Well, we're going to find out. He was on full health, I believe, when we last spotted him. Let's see how many hit points he is when we manage to spot him now. But as I highlighted on the ridgeline, the S1 just so much better on the ridges than the UDES. But this is where you're going to see where the S1 really does suck. Scorpion doesn't even have to aim at my tank and he manages to penetrate me. I take 2 seconds to enter the siege mode before I'm able to shoot at him. And this is where, frankly, having a turret and having a bigger caliber gun is just way better. The S1 is absolutely terrible at assaulting its opponents. And if you try and play like that and just charge in, you're really not going to do very well in this tank. It needs to have favorable positions where it can angle its armor, of course, if it's going to be shot by 90mm caliber guns, or shall we say, just use a ridgeline to hide the majority of its tank where it can creep over, fire using its excellent aim time, accuracy, and penetration, and pull back, hopefully before the enemy has managed to hit it. But at these short to mid-range engagements against tanks with turrets, you are just going to get absolutely outclassed in the S1, and tanks like the Rheinmetall Scorpion are going to be way better than the brand new Tier 8 Swedish tank destroyer. So here are the results in a great game for the S1. This was our ace tanker, 1,418 base experience points. We can also see that that T30 had quite a game. He actually outdid me on damage and got a high caliber. What about the profitability of the S1? That's something that everyone wants from a Tier 8 premium tank, right? 135,000 credits received, after resupplying the ammunition, auto-repairing the vehicle, and also resupplying that premium consumable, the coffee and cinnamon buns, we make 95,000 credits profit. Not too bad indeed, and I really think that it's going to be very hard to lose credits in this tank unless you unnecessarily load and waste premium ammunition. So next you might be asking, how can I get my hands on it? Well, the S1 is coming to the premium shop very soon, and expect it to cost the same as the Patriot or the Defender, for example, because I believe this is priced at just shy of 11,000 gold. And I think this vehicle will sell rather well because number one, it's the first tier 8 Swedish tank in the game. Number two, it allows players who have not progressed up the Swedish tank destroyer line to be able to purchase the siege mode and be able to try out that hydropneumatic suspension. And thirdly, this is the only option for players to be able to train up their Swedish tank destroyer crews. And finally, my opinion and concluding remarks. Is the S1 a replacement for the UDES? Well, not really. The UDES is still by far the better sniper. It is more accurate, it has pretty much the same DPM, it's got better camo, it's faster. And so if you want to play the sneakiest and fastest tier 8 Swedish tank destroyer, then you want to stick with the UDES. However, the S1 is still 85 to 95% as good as the UDES in that sneaky long-range role. And there's no doubt that it will outperform pretty much all of the other tier 8 tank destroyers for being a long-range sniper. But the key strength of the S1, unlike the UDES, is that it actually has some armor that's effective against 90mm caliber guns and less, and so that means that you're going to be able to brush aside the tier 6, 7 and 8 tanks, well, at least the medium and the light ones, until they start firing high explosive anti-tank or high explosive rounds at you. And furthermore, the S1, as I've mentioned, is just so much better on the ridgeline than the UDES, with the 8 km/h top speed limit. Just feels so much better indeed. And so would I recommend the S1? Well, if you've played the high tier Swedish tank destroyers and you like that playstyle, you're going to get more of the same with this tank. And I think that experienced and very advanced players will be able to do exceptional things in this vehicle. However, if you haven't tried the siege mode and the high tier Swedish tank destroyers, and you just want to pick up one of these tanks at a whim, I think you're going to seriously struggle and feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall, at least at first. And be prepared to play hundreds of games in this tank before you really start to get a feel for how you're doing. But then again, even if you don't do very well, you're still going to be making exceptional credits, as it is a tier 8 premium. And so hopefully you enjoyed this video, or maybe it was just useful to you. If it was, please give it a like. And if this video has sparked your interest in high tier Swedish tank destroyers and you want to see my full opinion on the UDES, then simply click through up here or use that more info icon in the top right hand corner of your screen. And let me know in the comments all of your opinions on the S1. Do you think it looks absolutely awesome? Do you think that it's going to be absolutely awful? Do you want to get your hands on one ASAP, or are you going to give this one a miss? And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.